Welcome to Wisdom Talk Radio, a collaborative community of explorers in conscious living. I've always loved finding the connections between what seem like disparate disciplines, and it's just the way I work. These connections, I find, are the fertile ground for discovering and creating new operating systems. It's how we unlock our potential. My guest today is a pioneer and bridge builder, and I look forward to a fascinating conversation with him. I'm Laurie Seymour, host of Wisdom Talk Radio and CEO and founder of the Baca Institute. Head there to discover your quantum connection with your inner guidance by taking the Quantum Connection Quiz. We are each designed to connect differently with the universal field, with Source. Knowing your own way of doing that is the first step of aligning with your inner guidance at a deeper level than you ever thought you could. It's the secret to having abundant flow in your business and personal life. So my guest today is Andrew Newberg. He is the research director of the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and a professor in the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University. For those of you who don't know, that's in Philadelphia, where I was born and raised. He is the author of 10 books, including the bestseller, How God Changes Your Brain, and is regarded as one of the most influential neuroscientists working today. He is a pioneer in the neurological study of religious and spiritual experiences, a field known as neurotheology. You can see why who I am really wanted to have Andrew on today. His research includes taking brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states in an attempt to better understand the nature of religious and spiritual practices and attitudes. Welcome, Andy. I am so delighted to have you here on Wisdom Talk Radio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
You are welcome. So, as I was saying to you before we started this, that I'm so interested in your work in neurotheology. And I'd love for you to describe what that is. And then, this is a two-part question, and then to build us the bridge that you took into writing your current book, Brainweaver, about optimal brain health.
So, two great questions to start. For me, neurotheology is what I like to refer to. It's an emerging field of scholarship and research. To me, I think the simplest definition of it is that it is the field that helps us to link the relationship between our brain and our religious and spiritual selves. So there's a couple of important points about that, though. One is that it is not unidirectional; it's bidirectional. So it is not just science studying religion. It is not just religion commenting on science, but it is taking these two very powerful forces of human history, our science and technological on one side, our spiritual and religious on the other side, and letting them look at each other, help to understand each other, and ultimately help us to understand ourselves more effectively. Now, a couple of other important points about neurotheology, I think as a term at least, are worth mentioning. One is that for me, for the term to work, I like to define both sides, the neuro side and the theology side, very broadly. So the neuro side is not just neuroscience, although certainly it includes that, and neuroimaging, but it includes the broader aspects of medicine, how we think about the body and the mind-body connection, aspects of psychology, even anthropology, sociology, all the ways we kind of get at the human mind and brain. And then the theology side, theology, of course, is a very specific discipline that has to do with how we kind of analyze a given tradition. And so we can talk about theological questions, things that relate to aspects like questions like about free will and sin and revelation and so forth. But also it expands beyond that. So it is not just thinking about theological questions, but various beliefs and attitudes that people have, behaviors that people do because of religious and spiritual beliefs, different practices, meditation and prayer, experiences that people have, and I know we can expand and talk about each of these,
Mm.
but really kind of looking at the broad aspect of all different types of religious and spiritual phenomena. So I think if you think about neurotheology in that kind of context as a two-way street and as very broad on both sides, that to me is what allows neurotheology to become a field that I hope and think will become very, very important as we go forward.
Mhm.
And it is in terms of your second question about how that led me into the discussion that we have in Brainweaver. One of the things I like to say about neurotheology, and that gets me very excited about it as a field, is that it ranges from the very esoteric. So we can have talk about philosophical questions, the nature of reality, what is
Mhm.
consciousness, and so forth, to very practical aspects. So does a certain kind of meditation help to improve anxiety? What does yoga do to the human brain? Does it affect our immune system? So you get into these very practical aspects of that. And that is what ultimately led me into not only looking at religion and spirituality from a brain perspective, but other aspects of human health and well-being. And so our social being, our psychological being, and ultimately our biological being, how all of those different dimensions of who we are come together to help us to create some kind of health and well-being, some optimum health of the brain itself. And so it was kind of a natural development of the practical side of neurotheology to be able to explore all the different ways in which we can help to make our brain healthy.
So can we take that even another step further? Because that's actually what I was thinking about as you were describing neurotheology is, okay, understanding, and we know that while understanding is fabulous, and that I spent many decades, wanting to understand everything about me and everything about life and others. And that's why I went into the field of psychology. But then we go beyond that into what you started with is talking about how to make that practical. What are the practical applications of this? And there's a couple of ways we can go with that. We can look at, okay, things like, how is it useful in terms of anxiety or depression or, things that people are struggling with. The other side of that, and I'm sounding like they're two different ways of going about things, but it's really not that simple. It's not that binary, or it's
Right.
not binary. But the other that I'm focused on here, or wondering about how you might see it, is about our potential as human beings. In other words, from the perspective of thriving, how might this research and your discoveries and the ways that you're conceptualizing all of this, how might they add to how we use our own system, our own
Sure.
physical, emotional, energetic system?
Well, we actually wrote another book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, which I think, very much addresses that question, where
Uh-huh.
we talk a lot about the most intense types of spiritual experiences that people have. It's based off of a lot of data from an online survey that we ran over a period of about 7 years, where we got over 2,000 people talking about their most intense religious and spiritual experiences and under what circumstances they had those experiences, what types of religious backgrounds they came from,
Mhm.
and really putting together this whole set of what effectively is a varieties of spiritual experience, which actually is the
Mhm.
next book I have coming out. And in there we talk about what are these experiences, the spiritual aspects, the numinous, the
Mhm.
God experiences, and so forth. And part of where that leads us is one trying to understand those experiences. So when people have an experience like that, there are certain characteristics of it
Mhm.
that signify or identify it for that individual as this kind of experience,
Mhm.
that takes them to that next level, as you're talking about. For example, one of the main characteristics that that people talk about, is a sense of clarity.
Mhm.
So when you get to that next stage, when you get to that that spiritual experience, it provides you this sense of clarity, a sense of meaning and purpose in the world, that you understand the world in a way that you never have before.
And
And of
it
course,
changes your life then.
and it changes your life and it changes your brain.
Yeah.
So the
Okay.
way your brain looks at the world, and the way you perceive the world, your emotions, your thoughts, and so forth. Yes, and it is transformative. And in fact, in our survey, and this is some research papers that we published, you know, 80-90% of people will say that these experiences made them feel better about their sense of health and well-being, their sense of meaning and purpose in the world, certainly their sense of spirituality and religion.
Mm-hmm.
They no longer fear death, for example. And only a very, very tiny percent, 1 or 2%, ever said that these experiences made them feel worse, which in and of itself is a fascinating question, which we can
Mm-hmm.
get
Mm-hmm.
to. But anyway, so there's this sense of clarity. There's a sense of intensity. These experiences, there's something that makes them more so than kind of our everyday reality experiences. And so that's important in terms of some of the emotional centers of our brain, making us feel these experiences extremely deeply and very powerfully, which give them that transformative aspect. In fact, it's interesting that the emotional centers of our brain that get triggered by these experiences are also tied deeply into our memory aspects of them, the
Right.
memory parts of our brain. So we remember them vividly, and that's part of also how they transform who we are. So, there are certain characteristics of these experiences. And then from there, we can also talk a little bit about, even more directly about the question that you were raising about, well, so how do we do this? Are there pathways that we can take to help people to engage that higher sense of themselves, that next stage, whatever people want to call it. And of course, this then spills back into the brainweaver concept about how do we, while there's certainly the whole biological piece of things and avoiding Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and so forth, but there is that other aspect of overall health and well-being, a perspective on the world which is different than what the sort of the everyday experience is. And those very positive experiences can typically lead to very beneficial psychological and even physical health benefits, because it changes the whole set point of how the brain and ultimately the body are operating.
Oh,
And
I love that.
we
So
talk
say
about all
something
that.
more about changing the set point of how our operating system changes.
Well, so, this is part of what we have started to look at. A lot of our studies that we talk about, for example, in Brainweaver, look at people longitudinally. And if we take them down various paths, working on their diet and nutrition, working on a meditation or prayer practice, whatever intervention that you do, we do brain scans before and after, and we can show that there are lots of differences that are going on. So different parts of the brain are more active, other areas of the brain are less active. And one of the things we talk a lot about in Brainweaver is the idea of balance and how you kind of create an appropriate balance in the brain. So what we think happens during these kinds of practices and these very intense experiences is that it does kind of rebalance the brain. And there's something in imaging called functional connectivity, how different parts of the brain are actually connected to each other. And so, what we see is that these are actually changed by these experiences. It changes the way the brain essentially is kind of wired, works together in one way or another. And that in and of itself is very, very important. Now, another study that we did, which addresses this question in a slightly different way, was an interesting study that we did looking at not just how different parts of the brain are connecting to each other, but the amounts of different neurotransmitters in the brain. And so, this is a whole other area of looking at the brain. But some of the critical molecules in the brain, like serotonin, like dopamine, we had a study where we sent people through a very intense, very immersive, transformative, if you will, spiritual retreat program. And we scanned their dopamine areas and their serotonin areas initially. And then after, they went through this program for about a week, and then they came out and we scanned them again. And what we showed was that their brain was more sensitive to the effects of serotonin and dopamine, which are very important molecules in the brain that have a lot to do with, dopamine is regarded as the feel-good molecule. It's in the reward system of the brain, so it gives us these uplifting feelings. And serotonin has been highly implicated in depression when serotonin levels go low. then people wind up with depression. And of course, if you really stimulate serotonin levels, which is what we see in like psychedelic compounds, then you get this extensive release of of serotonin in the brain, which can lead to these euphoric, kinds of feelings, and also transformative and even spiritual like experiences. So we're able to see that the brain has actually sort of changed the way it works, and we can observe that directly, so that we can then start to link up what's going on inside your head with how the person actually feels.
Wow. Wow. I love it. I get very excited, and my mind starts to go in so many directions that it's like, okay, what are we going to do here right now? No, what I mean in our conversation, because there's so many places that I want to explore. So
the sky is the limit when it comes to neurotheology. I'll give it that.
Boy, is it ever. And it's beyond what we even think it is what I'm realizing. Because you're talking in ways that, you're focusing on the brain, you're focusing on these numinous experiences. And then we really go beyond that, because all the research that the quantum physicists have been doing for decades now and demonstrating the way in which we are part of this quantum field. We are not separate from anything else. And yet when we look outside of the world and we see what's going on in the world today, what I at least see is so much experience of separation, of division.
Right.
And you're talking about the changes in the brain that really relate to connectivity, not just connectivity, connectivity at the microcosmic level, and then extending out from there, that sense of being connected to the universe, connected to others, and so forth.
Well, and there are two really important points in there. So, one is that I didn't get to mention yet, when it comes to those spiritual experiences, that they're, one of the other critical elements, one of the core elements of that are feelings of self-transcendence and feelings of connectivity. And so one of the areas of the brain that we have looked at with the brain scan works that we have done is in an area of the brain called the parietal lobe, located more towards the back of the brain, which takes our sensory information and helps us to create a sense of ourself and how ourself relates to the world. And what we find in these very intense practices is a profound decrease of activity in this area, which actually makes interesting sense, because if this area normally kind of takes the sensory information and helps us to create our sense of self and how our self relates to the world, when activity in that area starts to quiet down, we lose that we lose that sense of self, and we lose that sense of boundary between ourself and the world. So we feel a sense of connectedness, a sense of oneness, either between ourself and the world, or even with the objects that are in the world. That's the classic notion of being one with everything, or some kind of universal oneness. And so that is a very fundamental part of virtually all of these spiritual experiences that people have, and has, again, the transformative effects. So, that is a very important aspect of what we need to look at when it comes to these experiences. And the other point you mentioned about quantum mechanics and so forth is that I wrote another book about 10 years ago called Principles of Neurotheology, and really try to outline what the field of neurotheology looks like and what it can do. And one of the aspects of that had to do with, not just relying on existing approaches, not just looking at what we can know from an MRI scan, but really, thinking outside of the box and knowing that trying to track down what happens during a spiritual experience in somebody, we need to look at the biology, but there may be more to it, and whether that ultimately has to do with other types of energy, quantum mechanics. To me, while we should be appropriately skeptical, or certainly analytical, I should say, I think the term that we've sometimes used is a scoptimist, so that you're skeptical, but in a positive way, in a constructive way. And
let's be open to what we can discover.
And be open, right? And that to me is a very fundamental principle of neurotheology, which is that until we really can shut the door on something, we should be open, and we should look at it. And certainly there are lots of studies out there which have shown some fascinating results about the mind and consciousness having the ability to apparently get beyond the brain. And while I'm also not willing to just say, oh, yep, absolutely, this happens, we have to take those accounts and those studies very seriously, and think about what mechanisms may, how that may occur, what that may mean, and how we think about it. And so,
and then also how to test for that. I mean,
and how to test for that. Exactly.
I have a friend and colleague who has been involved in this work with me for decades, and he is a cellular biologist and a research scientist. And I remember him saying a long time ago that science has never caught up to where this kind of experiential energetic level is. And so, until that happens, it's going to be harder to get the kind of fundamental research that people will look at and say, oh, yes, that's true.
Right. And the big, $100,000 question is where we ultimately are in understanding the universe in terms of matter versus consciousness or mind, or whatever terms people want to use. Is there something that goes beyond the material world? Or is it all, quantum mechanics itself gets pretty wacky,
right.
Even though it's all material. So, or I guess,
well,
it's at least
particles, waves,
right. I mean, at least from the physics perspective. But is it touching into something that is different? And if so, is that something which is, really just the material world in a way that we don't understand it? Or is there something else, some other characteristic of the world? And a number of years ago, and I mean, this is obviously maybe an argument that stems back thousands of years, and Descartes with the duality and so forth, is where does sort of consciousness and matter come about? And is consciousness and our thoughts and our feelings, do they derive from the brain? Or is the brain kind of along for the ride and just helping us to feel these experiences? And, as I always point out, even to my most staunch materialists, you got inside your brain, you have neurons, you have sodium and potassium depolarizing across the membranes, you have neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, you've got blood flow and metabolism and electrical activity and quadrillions of neurons all interconnected with each other. Where in all of that are our thoughts? Where in all of that are our experiences? And the bottom line is we don't have an answer to that question. So
where does consciousness lie?
Where does it come from? Right.
And that if you've got all of those interactions, not one, not two, I mean, billions, then you've got something that has to be in some way beyond what we are able to see.
Right.
And that's
and you get into I mean, to me, the fundamental, to be, somewhat simplistic, but, you either, if you start with the material world, then you have this fundamental disconnect of trying to explain consciousness. I mean, it doesn't mean we won't be able to, but we certainly haven't yet, or gotten even close to it. So you could say, well, let's start with consciousness, which is certainly a valid perspective to take, and at the heart of many religious and spiritual traditions. But then you have to explain where the physical world comes from if you're just starting with consciousness. And so, now again, that's part of where I feel neurotheology has its strength, because it's saying, well, let's look at both. Let's not just start with one or pick one or the other and try to make it work, but let's try to bring them together in some way that helps us to better understand how to answer those kind of profound questions. So, whether we will get an answer that way either, I don't know. I mean, but
in your lifetime,
it's our best shot, I think. At least that's my feeling. So,
because you're a neurologist, that's your focus. Of course, then the brain and its concomitant parts are what's in your field of view. There's a whole set of work done around the mind in the cell. And that it's like, I don't know exactly how to bring that into this, but looking at consciousness being contained in every cell in the body. And that's my experience when I go into a deeper level of awareness. And then that changes how we speak about things, but also how we experience the world, and how we can tune into aspects of the world that might be outside of our normal everyday abilities to view and to touch and to make contact with.
Well, I think that this does start to, spill into the discussion about our latest book, Brainweaver, because, we talk about the different dimensions of the person, and we don't mean that in terms of, physical,
Right.
the 12th dimension or whatever, but, to us, there are four main dimensions of how we think of the person. And there is the biological, which is kind of the standard medical perspective to take. There is the psychological, and a lot of the work that you and many people in the psychological realm deal with, and our emotions, our feelings, and so forth. There's the social, which how we interact with others and with the world around us, and then finally there's the spiritual. And so, for us to achieve some kind of optimal brain health, we need to do our best to optimize and balance all those different dimensions, and the kind of thing that you're talking about here in terms of whether there is even more to us than just the purely material, that extends into that spiritual part, that spiritual realm. And of course, whether there is or not, that those are questions for neurotheology to continue to engage and discuss. But certainly, when we look at many aspects of integrative health and integrative medicine, while we feel, when we define integrative medicine, we one thing we say is, look, if you need if you need an antidepressant, if you need a medicine to help you with your cholesterol, well, fine, we don't have a problem with doing that. But there's these other aspects of ourself, and the social, and especially the spiritual, that can be very important for somebody's psychological and even biological health as well. And so, helping people to find their pathways, depending on whatever their religious or spiritual traditions are or perspectives might be. And even for those people who don't have a strong religious or spiritual belief, almost everybody still engages that sense of connectivity that you mentioned earlier. How do we connect to the universe? How do we connect to ourselves, to others, through, the various behaviors, charity, forgiveness, compassion, creativity. So, these are the kinds of things that people can work towards that help us to activate that spiritual side of ourself, and try to get that to be engaged in our overall health and well-being. And part of what we talk about in Brainweaver too is a little bit about, each person has to take some stock in who they are as a person. Where are their strengths and weaknesses? And some people have a very, very strong and very positive spiritual life, others less so. And so, each person has to kind of figure out where their strengths lie and how to optimize those strengths, and then use those strengths to work with the areas that might diminish them, and ultimately to optimize the strengths as well. So, if somebody does have a very strong spiritual life, then, using that to help them in their social context and in their psychological and even biological context could be very, very helpful. And for other people, it's inverted, it goes the other way. So, but these are the kinds of questions for us to look at and explore. And, we know there's a lot of data to support that people who have very strong spiritual, spirituality is a very important part of their lives. Religion and spirituality are important. They tend to have lower rates of depression and anxiety. They tend to have a stronger sense of meaning and purpose in life, and ultimately they have better physical health outcomes. So, whether or not that is because of the beliefs, whether there is something that they are able to tap into, which goes beyond just the purely biological. I mean, these are all the questions for us to continue to explore and see what these mechanisms may ultimately be.
Because I think they are tapping into something biological, and I don't think that's separate. Because I tend to not use the word spiritual or religious. I focus more on energy, and how we experience energy, but how we use that in everyday life. How in other words, for something like personal expression, I know you did a lot in your book. You wrote a lot about creativity, and I was like, oh, this is really important. Because I find that as people are able to express themselves creatively in their life, and that goes beyond just, music or art, or it could be how they cook dinner, how they live their life, using our life force. I mean, that's not exactly a scientific term, but
exactly.
But using that life force in a positive way, in a way that lines up with who they are, and that they actually don't dam it up, that they actually express that in the world.
Right. Right. And again, to me, part of what neurotheology is about is trying to understand that. And then hopefully through that understanding, we are able to help people to find those paths that are most effective for them. One of the important aspects of integrative medicine, and we talk about this a lot throughout Brainweaver, is the individualized aspect of all of this. There is certainly not a one size fits all, and that's certainly the case for the energies that you're talking about. How a given individual, what their overall energy is, biological or otherwise, what their balances are, what their imbalances are. Everyone, has whatever it is that makes them who they are. And so again, trying to work with that, trying to identify where various balances and imbalances are, and then to use, again, the strengths, the things that are well balanced, to help bring the things that are out of balance back into balance. To us is very, very important, and important to maintain that overall sense of health and well-being. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about things in that context of, not just the notion of a person's sense of their own energy and what that means for them, but to help people recognize what paths may be the most effective. And some people will follow the path of music, and some people will follow meditation, and some will yoga, and some traditional religions, some science. There is not a one size fits all that gets you to those intense experiences. In fact, going back to the experiences I mentioned in the How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain book, we talk a lot about the experiences themselves and how people describe them. And while on one hand we can talk about universal kind of core characteristics like the sense of connectivity you mentioned, the sense of clarity, sense of intensity, almost every one of them was completely unique as well. So each one of them, exactly what happens to each person is unique. And I say this a lot in my own kind of broader discussion about neurotheology and just understanding humanity, that given that each one of us has our own genetics for the most part, and then how our parents raised us, whether we had siblings or not, the experiences that we had, the teachers that we had, the things that we read, the traumas that we faced, the triumphs that we faced, and then here you are at the age of, 25, 40, 80, whatever. It shouldn't be a surprise that everyone comes to a different perspective. And, it goes back to something you mentioned earlier about how this sort of divisiveness and division that we see. And, on one hand, yes, that's part of what, to me, if there are 7.5 billion people in the world, there's 7.5 billion religions, and there's 7.5 billion political systems, and 7.5 billion, moral systems. No two people are the same, but but by the same token, we can try to find those commonalities, and but also embrace what those differences are, and appreciate that. And so to me, one of the things that I always feel like I've learned from all of my work in neurotheology is a very healthy respect and appreciation and compassion for the fact that people came to answers about the world that are very different than my answers. And then part of what we talk about in Brainweaver and some of our other books too, is, how do we keep people on those, on more positive pathways, and really try to avoid some of the times when these things do go very negative for people. And that is, I think, an important, whether you're talking about the mass murders that we see, or terrorists, or even just, people who join cults or something like that. There are times where things kind of go in a direction which is ultimately very detrimental, either for the individual or for the larger society. And I think by studying even, that aspect, to me, is a whole new area of neurotheology to really look at, when spirituality and religion, when these energies, go bad, and see what we can do to understand what happens, and maybe hopefully, find the pathways that can redirect people into something that's more positive. We know what happens. We know people hit those rock bottoms and drugs and all this stuff, and then sometimes, things turn around. Sometimes they don't. And
so if you were to speculate, given your expertise, really, if you were to speculate about some of the situations that you were just talking about, the kinds of, the terrorists, the mass murderers, the whatever, what part of the brain do you feel like gets activated that in a way that is detrimental?
Yeah, it's a
so many
great
things that
question.
are in that question that are, that I want to kind of restate, but you get my idea.
Yeah, I early on, I was trying to think of it in simplistic ways, and just that, maybe it's like an amygdala reaction that they just get very, fearful and all that. I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And I mean, not surprisingly, when it comes to the brain. We talk a lot in our books about the sort of the narrative, the perspective that each of us creates, the belief system that each of us creates, the story that each of us creates about ourselves and about the world. And one hopes that story, again, takes on a positive perspective, both with regard to ourselves, that we try to be good people, we try to be charitable, we try to work with other people, and do good things, and strive for from some higher enlightenment at some point. And to a certain extent, that we hope that the world around us has a certain degree of idealism and optimism that we might be able to take part in. But then, of course, to me, I think what seems to happen when, especially when you hear people interviewed who have gone down the paths of terrorism, cults, even some of the mass murderers who have been interviewed and so forth, that they get into this completely negative story about themselves and the world, that that the world is an evil place, that it's oppressing them, punishing them, whatever terminology they may use, and that ultimately, instead of trying to embrace the differences in the world, the solution appears to be to start to react in a very negative kind of way. And on a very simplistic level, one of the things that we talk about, especially when it comes to like religious and spiritual beliefs, but obviously this is true of political beliefs and moral beliefs and so forth as well, is that we create this story in our mind. We create the idea of what the world is. And we need that to survive. That's part of how our brain works. So we when we get up in the morning, we kind of know what to do. And now, when you get somebody else who says, wait a minute, you're not thinking about the world correctly, this is the right way to think about the world. And again, this could be a religious discussion. It could be a political, it could be a Republican talking to a Democrat or something. Your brain now has two choices. Your brain has the choice of saying, I'm right and the other person's wrong, or the other person's right and I'm wrong. Now,
there's always a third option.
well, there are third options, yes, that we could both be right in certain ways.
I don't even mean that. I think there's a wait. Let's hold that though. Let's hold that thought. Go ahead. Finish.
Well, again, on a very simplistic level, one option is that the brain says I'm right, and if the brain thinks that it's wrong, if the brain ultimately thinks that we don't understand the world properly, that is a very very fearful position to be in, because that means we don't understand the world, and that becomes dangerous. So it's far easier for our brain to say, wait a minute, no, we've got this right. We know how the world is. The other person must be wrong. And now, once we make that determination, as that other person continues to persist to tell us that we're wrong, now our brain starts to get more and more aggravated with that.
Right.
Why would they keep telling us that we're wrong when we know that we're right? And then, it becomes more of a, well, that person must be evil. Why would somebody do that to you? Why would some, maybe they're not even like, maybe they're like truly evil and should be part of the world, and so, when we think about, hurting or harming or killing somebody who doesn't believe the way we do, it's almost like they're not part of reality, and or at least the reality in the story as we understand it. And I think that's where we really wind up going down some very negative paths. Now, I don't know exactly how we change a given person's story about the world, but I think it is a pretty complex process that ultimately, for a lot of people has taken many, many years to get there. And, we see this a lot with people who have gone down these negative paths, that they've had very traumatic childhoods and, have a lot of issues and problems that they have faced throughout their life. But not always, and again, I mean, it's the story I think that they ultimately tell that leads them down one path or another. So, but I'm curious to know what the third option may be.
Well, here's how I live. One of the ways I live life is that there's always a third option. There's always another way to see things, to experience things than that either or perspective.
Right.
And when we're open to saying, being curious, and I'm be interested, what part of the brain does curiosity live in? What part gets lit up? When I'm curious about, well, how else could it be? How else, what if I want to have a loving perspective? I might not be feeling that in this moment, but I want to see it beyond the you're right or I'm wrong.
Right.
And to see not just from the simplistic, win-win. I don't mean it that way, but I really mean, what's another option here? I do that all the time with clients and with people in my trainings about looking at their business, for example. And they have an idea, I want to go down this way, but if I don't do that, I got to do this. Well, there's always another way to move forward.
Right. Well, and we another book that I wrote called "Why We Believe What We Believe," did talk a lot about that and talked about the value and the power of trying to embrace alternative perspectives. But it's a challenge. I mean, because it is scary. It's scary to suggest.
It can be scary.
It can be, right.
Yeah.
And I guess, but I think part of it is, and again, this may have something to do with how people's brains are wired, and again, whether that's just how they were wired genetically or how they, have been wired over time. But some of it may even be, but I think some of it certainly is genetic, which is, how do you react to new things? I joke with my wife about my eating habits because I am not a very adventuresome eater. And part of the reason why I am not is that genetically my taste buds are such that if I try something new, I know there's only about a 10% chance that I'm going to like it, because that's been my experience over my lifetime, that whenever I try something new, I generally don't like it.
So is that genetics or is that your experience?
Well, it's my genetics, because when I taste something new, it actually is bothersome to me. And so at least it's part of it. And then, of course, then as I did expand, and try new things, I mean, I did like some things, but for the most part, my experience has taught me over time that I just don't happen to find those foods very good. Now, my mentor in this whole field of neurotheology, this guy named Eugene DeQuilly, who was a physician and an anthropologist, he was the complete opposite. And he would eat, all kinds of crazy, tripe, if you know what that is.
An Anthony Bourdain traveler.
Yeah, it really, I mean, he would eat everything and he loved everything. And if you said, here, try something completely new, he would do it because he knew there was an 80 to 90% chance he would like that. So I think when it comes to beliefs and ideas, we're in a little bit of that same position. And again, some of it is the experiences themselves. If you were in school and you try to come up with something new and your teacher embraced that, then you'd be like, oh, okay, well, I'll try something new the next time. If on the other hand, the teacher was like, what a stupid idea.
Right.
Now that shuts you down. Now I'm a little nervous about trying something new. And again, it depends on our parents and children,
There's so many factors
and all that. Right.
Yeah.
But I think there's ultimately still a genetic component as well. I mean, each of us is probably wired. Some people are wired to be a little bit more fearful than others. And then again, but there is a range. I mean, it's the same thing with intelligence. There's some people who are highly intelligent and other people who are less so. And if everybody, well, the example I use, I'm a tennis player. So, if everybody practiced tennis 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day, we'd all be really good tennis players. But there's still going to be the Novak Djokovic's and the Roger Federer's of the world who are just going to be better than everyone else. I don't know why, but there's something about the way they built, and it's their body, it's their brain.
That's right. That's right. So, oh boy, I was going to go down the path and we're running out of time. So I actually won't go there. And that was about, can we change our wiring? But
well, the short answer is yes. I believe again,
so.
We talk about that in Brainweaver too. I mean, the different practices, bringing in things like your diet and nutrition, working to kind of consciously, purposely be open to new ideas. Yes, the brain, the good news is the brain can always be rewired. The brain can adapt and change as we go through our lives. So that's the good news. The downside is that it does take energy, and it does take,
Yes.
an ability to sort of push ourselves to that. And it's like being a bodybuilder. I mean, if you don't keep lifting higher and higher weights and stressing the muscle, it doesn't get bigger.
Exactly.
So if you just kind of sit there with your brain and you just kind of keep, going on social media and staying in the same stuff all the time,
Right.
your brain doesn't really change all that much. If you keep, looking at the other side and reading something different. And, if you're, whatever political side you're on, look at what the other side has to say, and not just like look at it and say, but to try to embrace it. Oh, what are they really thinking?
Why is this the way that it is?
Why is that important to them?
Yes.
And try to understand that. Then you do get to a point where you're able to start to expand and increase the connections in your brain, and that leads to optimal brain health. The very thing we started with.
So I want to ask you one final question. What has most surprised you to discover, you personally, in your research on spiritual experiences?
I guess I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's sort of two things, I guess, that kind of fit together. I mean, one is the incredible diversity of these experiences, while at the same time having certain core elements. But it really is the incredible diversity and the individuality of each of these different kinds of experiences that I find so fascinating, and a very powerful description of just what human spirituality is. And to that end, the point that I made earlier, which is that it's given me a very strong sense of compassion and an understanding and openness to the fact that people have different beliefs. And I hope that that's kind of a natural result of what neurotheology ultimately brings to the table, which is, how does it help to open us up to respect others, to appreciate others, to be compassionate of others, to learn from others, while still having our own, sense of belief as well. But that, we can all be in this world and try to use these different perspectives to try to ultimately understand what reality is all about. I mean, that to me is the fundamental question that I've been searching for, and I hope that neurotheology is a good pathway to answer that question. But it's what is real, and how do we know it? And obviously the brain's important in that, but it's all of our dimensions, and it's our energy, it's our connectivity to the world and to the universe, and of course, the spiritual experiences that people have where they feel that they connect with the most fundamental aspects of the world, which seem to go beyond our science and what our kind of everyday reality experiences are about. I don't know if that truly represents the real reality, but it's certainly something to take a good hard look at.
Certainly it is. Certainly it is. And I read this somewhere in your book, I think, that those were your early questions, and what propelled you to move into this. And I felt a resonance in me when I read that, because for me, it's always been about what's possible right. for us as human beings, and
yes.
what's possible then for me, really what is our potential. And that's why I had to look beyond the field of psychology, because I was really more interested in that than looking backwards and fixing things.
Right.
So
sometimes you have to do both.
Sometimes you have to do both. And I still find I have to do both. But Andy, how can people reach you, find you? What's the best way to do that? And it will be in the show notes, but I would love for
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly if people can go to the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and learn about our programs and some of our brain health programs and so forth, and look up the books such as Brainweaver. And then if people are interested more in the neurotheology piece, I have my own personal website, which is Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. And there they can find information about the books that I've written there on the topics and they're related to neurotheology, and even, look at the research articles that we've been involved in, so they can really look around and see a lot of what's been done, and hopefully learn about where we're going.
Yeah, I got to do that. And there's more. There's more for me to do.
Oh, there's lots more for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy, for being such a delightful guest, but for being willing to just jump in here and chew on all of this with me. Andrew Newberg, you are really doing some fine and important work, and I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. It's a lot of fun to talk about it with you.
Thank you. And thanks to our listeners for being with us today at Wisdom Talk Radio. Join us here, as I always say, for more wisdom, discovery, and illumination. Remember that you can find us on your favorite places to listen to your podcasts, wherever that is. And if you've enjoyed listening today, please do leave us a review, because that helps more people to access what we're doing here, really to access the wisdom that is being shared and to transform the world. And that's no small thing. For more about deepening your connection with your own inner guidance system, take the Quantum Connection quiz now.
Thanks for joining us here at Wisdom Talk Radio. We wish you well in your conscious explorations. For more information and to join in the conversation, our website is wisdomtalkradio.com or at Wisdom Talk Radio on Facebook.